the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. Ontario's anti-vax movement has expanded. Hundreds of businesses have formed a network to refuse the new vaccine passport rules and not refuse customers who are unvaccinated. The new underground network of businesses, which is actually quite open, is propelled by a range of reasons, from anti-vaccine sentiment to economic to just being sick and tired of almost 2 years of a deadly pandemic. Mayor John Tory says the city has received more than 500 complaints of these violations, but there doesn't seem to be any clarity on implementing Ontario's mandatory vaccine rules. So why are hundreds of businesses going back to business as usual and ignoring it all? And how will we flatten a fourth wave if Ontario's vaccine passport regulations might actually be just suggestions at this point? I'm joined by the Star's business and economics reporter, Jacob Lorinc, who will explain what's going on. Hi, Jacob. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the basics. First, can you walk us through what exactly are Ontario's current rules around vaccine passports when it comes to public spaces and businesses?
Right. So the Ontario government introduced vaccine certificates last Wednesday, and they require all residents aged 12 and up to show either physical or digital proof that they have received 2 doses of a government-approved COVID-19 vaccine when they enter certain businesses. So for the average Ontarian, this has little effect on your day-to-day life. You can still go to grocery stores, retail stores, malls, parks, and public spaces without doing anything differently. But if you want to go to an indoor restaurant, a bar, a nightclub, a gym or a theater, you now have to prove that you have followed the guidance of the government's health officials and taken this vaccine.
And technically, what can be the penalties for someone who flouts these regulations, for someone who doesn't show them or someone who's not asking for them?
Right. So under the Reopening Ontario Act, individual businesses have been tasked with enforcing these rules, so they're the ones who have to check people's certificates. If they don't, the province has warned that they could face tickets of $1,000 or a penalty that can reach as high as $10 million.
Have you heard any of that being implemented, though? Are there any reports of this happening?
No, not at all, and very explicitly so. The government says it's taking a quote-unquote education-first approach to their enforcement for now. That means that they'll respond to complaints regarding non-compliant businesses, and they'll visit those sites. They'll try to get those businesses to change their policies and follow the rules before they start charging them. So we don't know if there's an escalation system or a 3 strikes you're out kind of policy. It's all up to their discretion. And for now, they've said that they have not charged anyone. The City of Toronto has said that it's received over 500 complaints regarding businesses and compliance issues, but nobody's been charged.
And as usual, not everyone is on board. Tell me a little bit about the businesses that are not following the vaccine passport regulations that you reported on.
Right. So in Facebook groups and in various social media sort of hubs, lots and lots of small business owners and entrepreneurs, really just sort of disgruntled Ontario citizens, have converged to make their displeasure with these rules very well known. Lots of businesses have explicitly said that they are not going to comply with these rules at all. And this is for a host of reasons. In one corner of this group, you have, the anti-vaxxers, the people you see marching down Bloor Street, protesting the lockdowns, opposing everything that the government does to try to end this pandemic. And then you have business owners who feel like they have been pushed too far, that they have an unfair burden of enforcing a rule that other businesses are exempt from, that they don't want to lose clients any more than they already have. And they have this sort of feeling that they are the victims of some kind of government overreach. They really sort of convey this idea that they're just mad as hell and they're just not going to take it anymore.
Is there some meat to that argument? Are there different standards for different businesses, for example, retail giants like Walmart or Costco? Because I realize you did mention somebody talked to you about that in your piece as well.
Yeah, for sure. There are differences. You can walk through a Walmart, you can, feel every avocado in there, and nobody's going to check if you have been vaccinated or not. So there are exemptions on those businesses. But for restaurants, for gyms, you do have to show proof.
Right. You talked a little bit about how this was initially kind of being operated as an underground network of businesses that was deliberately not following these certification rules. Can you tell me a little bit about that? How was it operating? What was going on?
Yeah, so within these Facebook groups, members have developed several websites that essentially function as directories for businesses that won't ask you for proof of vaccination. So on these websites, restaurants, gyms, and bars have all advertised themselves, essentially saying, if you don't have the vaccine, don't worry about it. You're welcome with us. And, last I counted, one of the more popular websites listed almost 700 businesses across the province that are doing this. Now, I will say that many of these very vocal businesses are not actually required to check for proof of vaccination. So I've scrolled through these sites and I've seen a lot of retailers, a lot of, vegan whole food type grocers, also weirdly an inexplicable number of hypnotists. I don't know why.
Oh,
And I don't know if maybe they're unaware of how the certificate system works, or I don't know, maybe they're standing in solidarity with the other businesses, but they don't have to check anyone's proof of inoculation anyways. So there are a lot of them on these sites. That being said, there are also a lot of restaurants and gyms and bars on these websites. They're very real and they're outspoken too, and they are required to check people's vaccinations, but are not doing it.
right. But since that's not happening, it kind of voids the whole underground network concept that was originally being sort of touted about. So what are we seeing here? Is this kind of like the launch of the whole Adamson's barbecue 2.0 movement in a way? Because these are big numbers you're talking about.
Yeah, they're very big numbers and it's very public. Despite the province's threat of penalty, these businesses are very loud and proud of opposing these rules. Funny enough, there's a map circulated the other day from a Twitter account seeking to sort of quote unquote expose these businesses and sort of publicly shame them, but they're already public about it. They're more than willing to tell you that they're not going to go along with these rules. So whether it's an Adamson's barbecue sort of 2.0 movement, time will tell. I've found that sometimes when you approach these businesses individually, they retreat a little bit. They are maybe a little bit more concerned about being singled out and seem to like the sort of power in numbers quality that they have online. But that being said, a lot of these businesses are very angry and restless. And I expect we'll see similar kinds of outbursts from individual businesses as we saw from Skelly.
We'll be right back. And you spoke to some of these business owners and you're already talking about some of the reasons, some of which could be association with the larger sort of anti-vaccination school of thought. There's been economic reasons as well. And to be fair, small businesses, we did see them suffer a lot of economic devastation in the aftermath of this pandemic since last year, right? So what are they talking to you about, some of the business owners that you spoke to?
So some don't believe in the vaccine or even the pandemic. They really embrace those conspiracies. That's just some of them, though. Lots of them think that it's unfair to their business. There are plenty who told me that they do believe in the vaccines. They believe in the pandemic. They're on board with everything, but they don't understand why they have to enforce these rules, but other places don't. They don't seem to totally understand the exemption rules. And it's sort of a feeling that's lingered throughout this pandemic for small businesses, which is that they're given these expectations and responsibilities that bigger players are exempt from. And they feel like the government is sort of going after the little guy. And so, it does seem a bit reckless maybe to make all this noise online because they can be fined and, maybe they'll lose money this way. But there are a lot of businesses that say that they don't really care anymore. Of the businesses that I spoke to, there was one restaurant owner who told me that she's lost tons of clients already. She's lost tons of money during the lockdowns. She has all these loans to repay, and she feels like she loses whether she follows these rules or not. So, she essentially said to me verbatim, what do I care?
But on a practical level, are these new rules actually bad for business, though? How would mandatory vaccination certifications affect them negatively? Because some of them are using that as an argument, right?
Yeah, I think it really depends. There are plenty of businesses who have spoken to us, who've spoken to me and my colleagues who said that they are completely unaffected by these rules, who can operate the same way. And it's very important to note that, it also means that by following these rules, in all likelihood, the chances of a deadly virus swirling around your business is much lower. I'd call that an improvement. But that being said, I think it does largely depend. There are businesses who feel like, they're worried that would-be patrons might not have a certificate ready. They might not have their ID ready. They don't want to turn away more customers, especially after all this time in the pandemic where they've had to. I'd also say that there are some parts of the province, as we know, that, aren't as friendly to the vaccination rules, and you might get flack for following these rules. There was a story the other day of a PPC candidate in London who recently called out a small restaurant online for not letting him dine because he didn't have his proof of vaccination. And that owner received a lot of predictable backlash. So it's a mixed bag. There are restaurants that are worried about not catering to everybody. But, we've also seen plenty of businesses that have been perfectly fine with these rules. And Mayor John Tory the other day said that, the vast majority of businesses are complying with these rules. So there are plenty that are fine with it, but obviously some aren't.
That public call out you're telling me about is a really good segue into my next question, because I've also been seeing a lot of videos going viral of all these confrontations outside businesses. I saw one at McDonald's where customers were refusing to show their certifications, which kind of raises this big picture question about what this means for society in the long run and what needs to be done to regulate all of this to avoid potentially dangerous social interactions, which are building up, right?
Yeah, it's all extremely polarizing. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business has found that customers and businesses are extremely divided on this issue. Half of them think that it's a good idea to include these passports, the other half doesn't. And I think that we've all felt sort of a heightened level of tension in the past few months between anti-vax protesters and people who just want everyone to get jabbed so we can sort of get out of this pandemic. And I think with that sort of degree of urgency and sort of sense of frustration from everyone comes the potential for more of these dangerous social interactions and viral confrontations. And I think our governments have to be very attentive to that in the coming months.
And like you said, at this point, the mechanism hasn't sort of moved beyond the education approach, like the government said. So what could be the implications of this at this stage of the pandemic? Because experts have been emphasizing how this is the time to follow rules to flatten the fourth wave. So how can Ontario kind of get on top of that curve and increase vaccination rates, et cetera, if there's no actual standardization on these rules and they're kind of being taken more as suggestions than rules?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's something that the government will have to really think about, especially in the coming months. Not to quote Game of Thrones, but winter is coming, literally. It's about to get colder.
I love Game of Thrones quotes.
People are not going to sit down on patios anymore. More people are going to congregate indoors. We know what happens when people do that. And so these certificates are going to take on an even greater importance. That brings us to a pretty critical point in the pandemic where the government needs to decide how tough it can be with businesses that are really opposed to their efforts to stop COVID-19. And I think these are all incredibly tough decisions that have all kinds of ethical and legal and societal implications. But I think that's been the story of this pandemic all along.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. You've offered some really interesting insights. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
I was speaking to the Star's business and economics reporter, Jacob Lorinc. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabah Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Mutter, and Sean Pattenton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.